He called our daughter a pig. It begins with a voicemail I should never have had to hear, the one he left for an 11-year-old girl who had done nothing more than forget to turn on her phone. I was the one who pressed play. Ireland sat beside me, too quiet for a child who normally filled every space with energy. The message had already shaken her once, and she didn't want to hear it again, but I needed to. I needed to understand what had been said in my absence, what kind of weight had landed on her shoulders while I was in another room. The recording started with frustration, the kind I'd learned to recognize long before it ever reached a shout. He talked about how he called at the scheduled time, how she didn't answer, how she'd embarrassed him. And then, as it always did, his frustration swelled into something sharper and more personal. He accused her of insulting him deliberately, of disrespecting him, of humiliating him as a father. And finally, he told her exactly who he believed she was, a rude, thoughtless little pig. The phone felt heavier in my hand with every word I replayed in my head. Not because the insult surprised me. I'd heard versions of them for years, disguised as disappointment, wrapped in that particular shade of anger he used when he wanted to appear justified. But hearing those same patterns turned on our daughter was something I had never fully prepared for. Ireland watched me instead of the wall, looking for my reaction, trying to decode whether she should feel guilty or defended. That was the moment that broke something in me. Not his anger. Not the cruelty. Not even the threat to fly across the country to straighten her out. What broke me was the way she waited for me to tell her whether she was the problem. I had been absorbing that kind of anger for so long that I'd forgotten how unnatural it was. I had normalized it for myself, explained it away, bandaged it emotionally, and tucked it behind closed doors so the world could keep admiring the man they saw on screen. But in that moment, sitting beside my daughter, I realized that if I didn't stop it, she would learn to accept this behavior as love. That voicemail didn't come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years of unpredictable moods, sudden outbursts, and long cycles of apology that never truly held. But you don't tell those stories when they first happen. You believe things will get better. You believe the good moments represent the real man and the bad moments are temporary. You believe time and commitment and patience can transform volatility into stability. I used to believe that too. When I met Alec, I met the side of him that the world adored. Charismatic, brilliant, sharp-witted, able to shift the energy of a room with nothing but presence. He had that overwhelming charm some men carry like a weapon, the kind that makes you feel chosen just by being near them. For a while, I thought that intensity was love. I thought attention meant devotion. I mistook emotional volatility for depth. But the intensity came with a shadow. The same fire that made him magnetic could turn dangerous fast. I learned the pattern early. Frustration, escalation, accusations, withdrawal, and then remorse. Always remorse. Always a promise to do better. Always a quiet moment after the storm where he'd confess how deeply he felt everything, how heavily the world weighed on him, how much he needed me to understand. And I did. For years, I understood more than I should have. When Ireland was born, I told myself the arrival of a child would soften him. I imagined fatherhood melting the edges of his temper. I imagined long nights holding a baby turning him tender. I imagined all the cliches of domestic transformation. For moments at a time, I saw glimpses of it. The way he'd cradle her, the way he'd look at her with something like awe. But those moments were fleeting, and as she grew older, his temper found new targets. It always started small. A missed call, a changed schedule, a question asked at the wrong moment. With him, everything felt personal. Even a child forgetting to turn on her phone became an insult, a challenge, a deliberate act of disrespect. And once his mind interpreted it that way, the outcome was inevitable. There was always a storm coming. Our divorce only made everything louder. Lawyers took every emotion and turned it into ammunition. Court schedules became battlegrounds. Every request, every change, every misunderstanding became an accusation. In those years, Alec turned me into an enemy in ways I didn't think possible. He painted me as manipulative, spiteful, impossible. He accused me of poisoning Ireland against him. But the truth was simpler. I was trying to protect her from the volatility I had already survived. And then that voicemail arrived. The worst part wasn't that he lost his temper. I'd seen that enough times not to be shocked. The worst part was that he directed that same intensity, the same sharpness, the same capacity to wound, at a child who didn't have the emotional armor I'd spent years building. After the message ended, Ireland asked me whether I was angry with her. A child should never believe she is responsible for an adult's rage. Yet here we were, sitting in a living room that suddenly felt too quiet, too fragile, too small to hold the weight of what had just happened. I wasn't angry with her. I didn't tell her everything I felt. Not yet. But inside, something very old and very tired shifted. For years, I had explained away his behavior. To myself, to friends, to family. I had given him the benefit of every doubt. I had tried to protect him, even when he didn't protect me. But hearing him speak to our daughter like that removed the last excuse I had ever clung to. What I felt wasn't hatred. It was clarity. This was no longer a story about a marriage that had broken down, or about two adults who could not coexist. This was now about a child who needed at least one parent to draw a line. I replayed the message later that night, not because I needed to hear it again, but because I wanted to remember exactly where everything changed. His anger, his entitlement, the way he blamed her for his own disappointment, the way he threatened to fly across the country to fix her, the way he used humiliation as a tool. That voicemail became the moment I finally understood something simple. The only thing more damaging than living with that kind of anger is teaching your child to live with it too. I didn't hate him. I didn't wish him harm. I didn't need revenge. But for the first time in our long, complicated story, I knew with absolute certainty that I would no longer allow him to shape her understanding of love, respect, or safety. And once that truth settled into me, the rest of the marriage, the history, the passion, the promises, the grief, became a closed chapter. The man I had once loved had crossed a line he couldn't come back from. And the mother I had become was finally strong enough to say, enough. People imagine the end of a marriage like mine as a single, spectacular explosion, something dramatic, loud, final. In reality, the ending unfolded more like a long, steady collapse. It crept into the spaces between days, into the rhythms of parenting, into the way I observed my daughter brace herself before answering her phone. The voicemail was only the moment when everything I had been trying to hold together finally became impossible to ignore. The aftermath was immediate and deeply revealing. He did not deny what he had said to Ireland. Instead, he attempted to justify it. To him, an 11-year-old forgetting to turn on her phone was a personal affront significant enough to warrant humiliation. His frustration transformed, as it often did, into a belief that he had been wronged, that his anger was an understandable reaction to disrespect. The problem, in his eyes, was not the cruelty of his words, but the fact that she had failed to meet the expectations he had created. That was the part that alarmed me most, not the anger itself, but the lack of recognition that he had crossed a boundary no parent should cross. For years, I had carried the weight of his volatility quietly. I learned how to manage his moods, how to soften my tone, how to anticipate the direction of his irritation, so I could defuse it before it escalated. I believed, with a mixture of hope and habit, that my adaptability made the marriage functional. I never fully realized how much emotional labor I was doing until I saw my daughter absorb the consequences of his temper for the first time. The custody battle that followed unfolded with the intensity of a war. It stripped away whatever remained of civility between us. Lawyers dissected every year of our relationship and every decision I had ever made as a mother. Suddenly, I was portrayed as unstable, manipulative, obstructive. Every attempt I made to shield Ireland from emotional harm was reframed as interference. He leaned heavily into the narrative of victimhood, insisting that I had turned her against him. His outrage was constant, consuming, and it filled every hearing with its force. What struck me most during that period was how little space there was for the emotional reality of the child caught in the center. Ireland had become a piece of evidence, a point on a timeline, a witness to be evaluated instead of a human being attempting to understand why her father had spoken to her with such hostility. She was expected to carry adult burdens, and I watched the effects surface in small, devastating ways. The way she hesitated before answering unknown numbers, the way she monitored her own reactions, the way she tried to anticipate whether she was about to make a mistake she didn't understand. I knew then that protecting her required more than comforting words. It required boundaries strong enough to withstand his anger. His reactions during the legal process only confirmed what I had already accepted. He viewed every challenge as a personal injury, every limitation as an attack, every consequence as persecution. His concern was directed almost entirely toward how the public might interpret his actions, how headlines might damage his reputation, how the narrative might slip from his control. The well-being of his daughter was not the center of his focus. His own image was. I realized that I had spent years trying to protect a version of him I hoped existed beneath the volatility. I softened the truth for family, for friends, for the press, and even for myself. I carried the private weight of every outburst so the public could continue admiring the man they believed they knew. But the voicemail shattered the last illusion I had been holding on to, the belief that shielding him was somehow beneficial for our child. As painful as it was, I understood that I had contributed to a pattern by continuously absorbing the consequences of his anger without addressing its impact. I had taught myself endurance rather than accountability. I had allowed intensity to masquerade as passion and unpredictability to pass as depth. It took seeing my daughter's confusion to recognize how damaging that model of love truly was. Leaving the marriage had not given me emotional freedom, it had simply moved the conflict into a different arena. The real freedom emerged only when I stopped prioritizing peace and started prioritizing clarity. I no longer cared whether he thought I was difficult. I no longer cared whether the world believed I was dramatic or overreacting. I no longer cared whether my boundaries made me appear uncooperative. The only thing that mattered was that my daughter understood she was not responsible for soothing a grown man's ego. In the months that followed, the shape of our family changed. The court placed boundaries he could not ignore, and the atmosphere in our home slowly shifted. Ireland began to relax in ways she had not even realized she needed. Her laughter returned first, then her curiosity, then her confidence. I watched her rediscover the space to simply be a child again. People sometimes ask whether I hate him. I don't. Hatred requires intimacy, and I had already created distance between who he once was to me and who he had shown himself to be. What I feel now is a kind of sober understanding. He is not a man I need to fight anymore. He is not someone I need to change. He is simply someone I needed to stop enabling. The day he called our daughter a pig became the moment I stopped prioritizing his comfort and started protecting her well-being. Everything that followed, the hearings, the boundaries, the public scrutiny, was the result of that shift. And although the process was painful, it was also clarifying. I finally understood that the most powerful act of love a mother can offer is the refusal to let her child inherit her silence. And once I understood that, there was no turning back.